War is immoral, poverty is immoral, racism is immoral, police brutality is immoral, oppression is immoral, genocide is immoral, imperialism is immoral. This country represents all those things, all those things, all those things, all those things.
As children in the Northeast, we were told tales about militias out west. Doomsday preppers with stockpiles of food and military weaponry. Turns out they're real and merely part of a much larger phenomenon, one that this week's Global Warning guest understands better than most. On episode 8, I speak with Amy Cooter, an expert and regular consultant on extremist groups, domestic militias, and what she terms nostalgia groups, commonly referred to as right-wing or patriot. I think of the Oath Keepers. Co-founder and deputy director of the Institute for Countering Digital Extremism, which houses the Accelerationism Research Consortium, Amy Cooter's research includes a focus on the intersection of whiteness and masculinity, a la the Proud Boys, how lived experiences shape people's attitudes toward nationalism and racism, and how this results in group action, including from anti-government and other extremist groups. Her book, Nostalgia, Nationalism, and the U.S. Militia Movement, is the perfect primer on U.S. militias, exploring their complicated history from the Revolutionary War through the attempted insurrection, January 6th. Amy provides analysis for tech agencies, academics, and national security experts around the globe. She has served as an expert consultant on federal hate crime and domestic terrorism trials, and she has testified to multiple U.S. congressional committees. Today, on episode 8 of Global Warning, I talked to Amy Cooter about the biggest threats to our democracy, online and off, accelerationism and its connection to domestic terrorism, the state of extremist groups and militias today, the difference between the far right and far left, and what we can do in our communities to fight back and maybe even flourish. Remember, be sure to like, comment, and share, subscribe, and for exclusive extras, become an official member. Amy, thank you for joining me. Sorry about that lengthy introduction, but there's a lot to say about you.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for your kind words as well. I'm really happy to chat today.
Thanks, well deserved. So let's start with the threat. Name it and describe it for us. What should concern us most?
You know, I wish I had a crystal ball. I think it's hard to identify just one thing. And that's what's concerning at this moment. We're kind of in a crucible where our political environment, our broader social structures are really fomenting many different grievances, people feeling upset about one thing or another, different figures in the administration legitimizing that grievance and creating a situation where several different actors or the groups they represent could very well lash out, particularly as next year approaches with 2026 midterms and everything that is amplified right now going into our electoral politics.
Yeah, and for some, that lashing out and what that could result in, that's the goal. Take accelerationism, a term that may be unfamiliar to some. First, explain what it means, and then how does this mindset feed into domestic terror movements?
Sure. So in short, accelerationism is this idea that there's something so profoundly wrong with society that it can never be fixed through normative politics, not through voting, not through gradual social change, and that ultimately this is going to lead to the collapse of society. Some people kind of have this as more of a philosophical view, but we've seen a rise in what we call militant accelerationism, which is folks who think this is true and also think it's their job to make that cataclysm happen faster so that whatever results will come about faster. They don't usually have a clear vision of what exactly they want the future to look like. They just assume that it must be better than whatever we're dealing with right now. And we've seen that feed heavily into a variety of extremist actions. People who, for example, commit violence because they think that that will then trigger some sort of cascading event between the public and the police and then result in cataclysm. People who groom young children online into committing mass shootings or other mass violence because they think the same thing. And they think that in addition to the violence, it's about that corruption of youth that will hasten the end of society as we know it. So accelerationism, while sometimes it takes a little bit of a back burner to other ideologies or other expressions within extremism, it's a pretty common through thread that we're dealing with right now.
And what's interesting is that in a lot of ways, I can kind of understand where they're coming from up until the point where they want to destroy certain communities to, as you said, bring about that cataclysm. I don't see what's happening today as working for everyone, work for some, and that's intentional. And I don't see capitalism or incremental changes under capitalism necessarily working either, which puts me in a weird place where on that one thing we can relate. But I want to get into that later because I am very curious about your thoughts on how far left extremists might relate or not relate to the far right. But before we get into that, what would you say, and if this is even possible, is the state of right-wing extremism today? Obviously, it flourishes under Trump. Can you describe the growth you've seen, the changes you've witnessed, perhaps since the day Trump called the Nazis at Charlottesville very fine people?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of nuance. And so it depends a little bit on which particular group or entity that we're talking about. For example, militias right now, they're relatively quiet. And we think it's probably because the administration itself is conducting aggressive immigration actions and aggressive actions in other ways that they feel like their interests there are largely being taken care of. But if we're thinking across all these groups, if we're thinking about neo-Nazis, if we're thinking about people we call sadistic extortionists or nihilistic violent extremists online, we've seen a dramatic growth in them. And it's because, in no small part, of the legitimization that has occurred in this administration and beyond. Really globally, we're seeing this happen too. A lot of folks have talked already about how we've seen a huge increase in hate speech and anti-Semitism and some of the more traditional kinds of extremist vectors that we still care about very much. But I think that what's top of mind for me right now is the massive explosion in that online behavior that's really directed at young kids. And it has this accelerationist thread. And in addition to ultimately trying to groom some of them into mass violence, there are these really terrible intermediary steps that are sometimes linked to white supremacist ideology, often linked to misogyny, sometimes linked to other stuff too, but then encourage these young kids to physically hurt themselves, video record it, sometimes including sexualized acts. And then those kids get effectively blackmailed, sometimes their families too, into these awful harms that are increasingly problematic, not just for them, but for their whole communities. And I think that that's probably kind of the newest wave of what we've been talking about. And it's something that a lot of parents, a lot of educators still have never heard of.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's interesting. I was going to ask, for more details about specific groups, but I almost think based on what you've said that that's less important than getting into further detail about what you were just saying. Are there any examples of how the digital world plays into this and demonstrating how these networks, so successfully recruit to the point that maybe we could learn something from them, not about what they're recruiting for, but how they're doing it?
Right. I think that the answer is yes and no there, because the online technologies are part and parcel of everybody almost daily life now. And there are probably some negative aspects to how that changes how we think about other people and engage with other people kind of across the board. But there's some positive aspects to it too. So unless we're willing to completely get rid of technology, I don't know that there are easy answers here. It's also the case that these groups are particularly good at identifying vulnerabilities and amplifying them. And unfortunately, that's something that I think for ethical reasons, we don't necessarily want to do on the flip side. But it does tell us some important points we can push for prevention in terms of having conversations like this, making people aware that this is a risk, that, for example, kids as young as 8 are being targeted on sites like Roblox that are explicitly made for young children, gradually kind of groomed and shown violent images, gradually shown sexual images, coerced into moving into more private servers, other private spaces, and then really bombarded with this information. And so I think that both the prevention with the parents and also trying to push back on tech companies where they've kind of laxened some of their restrictions, where there are more spaces for them on the backside to monitor direct messages or other private communications is really going to be key here.
It's so interesting. And the reason I inappropriately smiled when you were describing that is because you brought up Roblox, and it reminded me of the anti-ICE demonstrations happening in that video game or that metaverse mini world or whatever. So that is an example of ways that a lack of surveillance and control could create a positive effect. And that is such an interesting conversation. How far can we take moderation and, and protection, without encroaching on civil liberties?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I don't think anybody wants us to degrade free speech, although I will say some of our peer countries do exclude hate speech from free speech. There's also some really early efforts in Congress right now to crack down on nihilistic violent extremism and specifically the 764 network in terms of how they very specifically exploit kids. But I do think there are some things we can do. So, for example, we've seen some cases that as this behavior escalates, the groomers, the people who are pushing kids deeper into this space, will send hundreds of DMs an hour trying to make it where this kid can't focus on anything else, just be really overwhelming and take up their entire consciousness. That's not a normal way to communicate. There's some other signals that are fairly unique to this space that would yield some starting points without necessarily restricting what other people are doing on those sites. Great
idea. Now let's talk about the response from individuals, outside of the big tech. We have umbrella groups now like 5051 organizing No Kings rallies. We've got the always unheralded local organizers feeding and housing their neighbors. And we have now entire communities perfecting communications and defense practices against federal agencies and local cops. Of course, these activities are criminalized, even when it's predominantly liberal audience or liberal actors. Are there also far left militias out there? Are they behind the scenes? If so, what are they up to? What is your take on them? And should they be classified alongside the likes of Atomwaffen?
The short answer is yes, they exist. Most of them balk really hard at the label of militia. But if we're talking about people who are armed, who have certain anti-government tendencies, who get together and train with their firearms and train to do other kinds of community intervention, those core elements look the same as the more right-oriented militias that I've studied for 2 decades. And I think that frankly, we need to do more work with them, understanding their motives, understanding what their goals are, because just to be honest, the more right-wing oriented ones have kept me very busy, and I haven't dug into them as much as I would like. And also, at least from the outside perspective, they're a little bit more responsible with their OPSEC. They're less trusting sometimes than some of the right-wing ones have been. We just plain know less about them from the outside perspective. And I want to be really clear that I think that of those that I have encountered, the vast majority of them see themselves as defensive, as resisting illegal government often actions, but other harmful actions that are coming into their communities in situations where they can't rely on the police, they can't rely on other aspects of the government to defend them in ways that other communities might be defended. But at least hypothetically, there is also a concern that some of them might be plotting some kind of attack or political violence that we wouldn't necessarily want to endorse.
Interesting. I would say 99% of that is exactly what I wanted to hear. And if it wasn't clear to you or others, I'm not what they might call an objective journalist. It's pretty clear where I stand. And maybe you could just take me a little bit into the last point you made. Is there an example of violence of any kind, because for me at least, violence against people and violence against private property, for instance, are very different. Are there any forms of violence that, you wouldn't officially endorse, of course, but would see differently than kind of what we were hinting at?
Yeah, I try to keep my personal politics a little bit away from how I frame the research, because I think that it's important to try to maintain some academic objectivity on certain issues. But I will say I definitely agree with you that traditionally we have seen that left-oriented actors don't always succeed, but usually take great care to target property and make sure as much as they can that individuals won't be present in a building that they're planning some bomb or demonstration or whatever at. Historically, we've also seen just much lower levels of violence that could be attributed to anything left-wing. I will say we're in this moment where it's harder to fully differentiate between traditional right versus left structures, because ideologies, because perspectives on the government are messier than they have been at some points in our history. And we definitely don't have a clear instance of some left-oriented group doing the same level of violence, or what we usually call, before it's been politicized, domestic terrorism, that we've seen for the last many decades in this particular country. There has been quite a bit of rhetoric about the concerns coming up next year as our governmental systems are seen as less and less responsive to many people's needs. And I think that that's what we're monitoring for and concerned about.
Yeah, and in a way, not to be an accelerationist, but identifying the ways that average people or the predominance of people are not being cared for, and the fact that, as you put it, that there's a blurring of left and right and thoughts about our government. Perhaps it's an opportunity to organize as the 99% again, since we all have that in common, that we are all oppressed by the oligarchy, by the 1%. Any thoughts on that at a time when Antifa, whatever that may mean, anarchists, even carrying zines, have all been criminalized?
Yeah, I genuinely think that it takes all of us to fight fascism. I just do. I think that there are a lot of folks who have started very slowly to understand what an administration that they previously supported might be doing that is harmful to them and harmful to their communities. And I have a lot of activist friends, a lot of even academic friends who aren't willing to open up the ranks to them. And I get that. I get the concerns about not just accountability, but also really understanding. But I personally think that anybody who is willing to stand up and fight some of the problems that we are very much facing right now, that will absolutely get worse if we cannot get more organized, they should be included in this. And then we can sit them down and have longer term conversations about why their behavior contributed to where we are. I think we have to stop the ball rolling down the hill before we can break it into its constituent pieces, personally.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as long as you're prioritizing InfoSec and OPSEC and you're not bringing in current Nazis, people, as an abolitionist, I clearly believe that anyone can be transformed. And to your point, a lot of people who voted for Trump are seeing the results and starting to think outside of that box. And it reminded me just of all the people who are like, you voted for Trump, you should suffer. That is not something I agree with whatsoever. And it's not a leftist ideology whatsoever. So people who are thinking that way should reconsider.
I agree. And I also just want to add too, really quickly, I think that a lot of folks who have that perspective still don't fully understand the echo chambers that many of those folks found themselves in, not just because of Fox News, but because of their communities, because of what their actual day-to-day concerns were, and the people who weren't necessarily coming to talk to them in a different way. And so, yeah, we have to talk about accountability. We have to talk about understanding, but we have to get to the point we can do that first.
Yeah, really well said. So we're up against the time. So it's about perfect to ask you, Are you seeing any signs of progress? What's working, and what can the average person do to protect against far-right extremism growing in their communities?
You know, it's tough, and it's probably not a 3-minute answer, but I think the biggest thing.
That's okay, by the way. We always go over. So
Awesome. Okay.
start from the beginning.
Cool. You know, it's not glamorous. It's not an easy thing, but I think the biggest thing is trying to know your community, being willing to confront your own barriers and your own biases that may very well have come up for good reason, but that nonetheless may be real barriers to us moving forward from this point, trying to understand that we should have hard conversations, not just with people we already agree with, but try to talk to people about why they believe what they believe. And you may never agree with them, you may never change their mind, but you may at least understand better about where they're coming from and what started that thinking in the first place. In terms of more active extremists, I think it's really important to try to know which groups might be active in your area. The SPLC, I don't always fully endorse them, just to be totally honest, but they maintain a pretty good map of which groups are active in given states and areas. And it's a good starting point. Familiarize yourself with some of the taglines, some of the most common icons. And if you see something tagged around town, you at least know what's likely there. Be willing to stand up and support your neighbors who may be targeted before you are. And I think people who are in leadership positions, whether it's in government, in schools, in churches, or whatever, really ought to go ahead and think hard now about what they're going to do if something awful happens in their community because of some extremist action. And be prepared to have a plan already about that. How are you going to support those folks? What are you going to say publicly? Even if it happens across town and you don't know anybody directly involved, it's really important to speak out and say, hey, there is a community here who cares about you. Not everybody's a Nazi or whatever it is in that particular case. And be willing to really think about what it means to have a democracy where not everybody's going to agree with you, but we should at least agree that we should try to support each other, should try to make sure everybody has a voice in this process, and avoid some of the folks who want to divide us and make it where we can't have these conversations.
Well, that was fire. So I'm glad we took the time. Thank you, Amy. I wasn't sure where this would go, if we would leave feeling afraid or inspired, and I'm glad it's the latter. There's a lot that we face, but there are opportunities for progress. And I'm really glad that we were able to share some of those today. For those listening, to learn more from Amy, visit amycooter.com. And if you've enjoyed this edition of Global Warning, be sure to like, comment, and share. Check out this and the first 7 episodes. Subscribe, and for exclusive extras, become an official member. Episode 8 of Global Warning has been sponsored by Zevo Life Superfood, Good Feels Cannabis Seltzer, and Shimmerwood CBD infused seltzers. Only the good stuff over here. Exclusive discounts using code WARNING. Link in video description. Thank you again to our guest, Amy. You were amazing. And stay tuned for episode 9.
Thank you so much.
War is immoral. Poverty is immoral. Racism is immoral. Police brutality is immoral. Oppression is immoral. Genocide is immoral. Imperialism is immoral. This country represents all those things. All those things. All those things.